Chapter 1. The day I learnt I was a demon was the worst day of my life. I won't lie. I spent most the day terrified of dying, or losing a limb. The first thing I heard, and thought about when I woke that morning was of demons. A were-cat scream echoed for a beat, before an answering scream, higher in pitch, called in the distance. It sounded like the packs were fighting, a territorial dispute most likely. There was a pride not too far from the temple. A muffled shriek drifted up through the floorboards, and I rolled my eyes when it happened on the next scream. I buried my head under the pillow, pulling my blanket up. New disciples thought the world was ending every time a demon passed nearby. It took them long to understand. If the wall was breached, the klaxon went off to warn us. I rolled out of bed, tripped over the mountains of fabric and crushed cans that littered the floor of my room, and head-butted the wardrobe door. It bounced back. Clothes flung over the top and spilling out the bottom had stopped it from clicking shut. I was not a dirty person, but a messy one. I was the kind of person who could make mess in an empty 4x10 box. Stood in my fraying bra and panties, I groggily scratched at my knee, trying to pull myself together. It took a lot of rummaging around before I pulled on my ragged jeans and faded t-shirt, some pre-rupture band on the front. Not the best gear for running, but I was going to have to go straight to class afterwards. I put my boots on and headed outside. It was dark. Dawn was hours away, and the grounds were eerily quiet. Fire drums set alongside the pathway flickered, and weak flames cast a sick flush over the cold ground. Electricity was hard to generate, so the sect cut corners where it could. Resources during the day, and after dark, focused on wall hotspots, places difficult for the clerics to easily defend, like steep ravines and cliff faces. These were the places demons too often breached. My eyes skipped over the temple grounds, and every graffiti wall, battered trash can was colored fondly in my mind's eye. The temple was an army base, before the rupture, but now it was the stomping ground of the sect clerics and their disciples. It was home. Safety. My eyes settled on the wall in the near distance, peeking out from the forest bordering the region. Past that electric fence was outside. Past that fence roamed the demons. I started at a jog. In no time I was at the main gate whistling to the security guard who barely looked up from his book. I wondered where he'd gotten that. Books made purely for entertainment were as rare as plain paper. The sect had a library, of course, right here at Temple, but you had to have serious pull with the priests to be able to rent one. We lucky disciples got to feel the smooth pages of a book on a regular basis, even if they were educational, and my envy was brief. The guard caught me eyeing up the pages and placed it on his lap. He waved me on as the gate cracked to let me out. Leaving Temple, I was soon on a wide and flat lane gravitating toward the forest. I reached the wall and stared at it. Each time I came here I asked myself the same question: was defying sect doctrine and stepping past this point worth it? The excited thump of my heart told me the answer. I glanced behind to scan the roadside and check I was not in sight. Confident I was alone, I slid through the sliver of space between the charged wires, then held my breath for a beat. There was nothing but silence. I had no idea how I'd done it, but one morning I was tired of plodding the same ground, and I'd looked out into the forest with its thick tree trunks, jutting roots, and seen a thrilling new route to push myself harder and faster. I had stood, and stared at the webbing of steel, then wished for a hole to climb through. The wires had just unraveled without setting off the klaxon. I remembered thinking with a horrible kind of panic that I had somehow done witchcraft, and was convinced I was the blackest kind of evil. Then I realized how ridiculous I was being, and figured it was a coincidental gift from the universe, or something. Now every morning I had a new obstacle course to enjoy. The trees were tall, and the air was fresh and clean and free. I ran, racing the beat of my own footfalls. Cold wind whipped past, pushing hair into my face. Gods, how I loved to run and revel in the illusion of freedom it gave. I was the fastest disciple at the temple, and the best at cross-country. It took a lot to tire me out. I ran until the forest became too dense for me to sprint without tripping over roots. My chest rising and falling was a pleasant feeling I rarely got to experience, and only could experience when I ran outside. Pushing at the long and dark tangle of my hair, I wished there was less of it. I snapped off a knobby twig from a shrub at my heel and pulled it back into a messy bun, using the twig to pin it there. I was distracted, and only because a raven boldly cutting past drew my attention from the task of managing my hair, did I see a movement at the corner of my eye. A figure strode away from me up a leafy incline, into the light side of the daybreak. "Hi!" I called, my voice low. The retreating shape paused, only to dart deeper into the gloom. Cresting the slope it winked out of sight. I ran after it. It seemed like the thing to do at the time. Skidding to a stop at the slope summit, I let out a surprised grunt. I could see down and far out into the forest. There was nobody down there, nothing but more trees. Fear whispered in my ear, no humans are supposed to be outside, but I shook it off. Such a thing was surely nothing but my imagination. No demon would be this close to the temple. It would be like a human who wanted to live a long life doing a jig with their eyes closed on the edge of a cliff. Then I saw it again. The shadowed figure was there when I turned around, but was at the bottom of the slope. My feet skipped back, then there was no more floor. I remembered the same time my head moved to where my feet had been, that I'd been standing on the apex of a steep and high slope. I went down. I tumbled backward and ended up rolling and rolling. The world churned around me, but leveled out abruptly as I crashed into the base of a tree at the slope's underside. I was up in the air and my shins mashed against my forehead. Oh gods, it hurt. I rocked my body until I fell onto my side, and pulled my legs back to curl them under me. I breathed in and out slowly, mentally checking myself over. Nothing felt broken. I sat up and stretched it out. No, nothing was broken. The pendant I wore around my neck pressed into my collarbone awkwardly. I fiddled with it until it hung properly, and the leather cord was no longer choking me. I stood and rubbed at my head, then tried to get my bearings. The slope was too steep to climb back up, and I wasn't much into rock climbing. Like most people, I was reasonably tolerable of heights, up to a certain point, and tolerable with deep water, up to a certain point. And even agreeable with confined spaces, up to a certain point. Heights, especially high, were a stickler with me, despite my love of the things you could do when you were especially high. I had a way of pretending the floor was much closer than it truly was. Nevertheless, the slope was too high to pretend, so I was either going left or right. Determined to stay calm, I ignored the first curls of fear in my stomach. I hadn't explored this far out into the forest yet, and based on how long I had run for, I was at least 10 miles from the wall. I was not worried about the time. I could still get back for breakfast and with enough time to walk to class with Alex. Looking to the east, the sky was lightening to blue, but the sunrise was always painfully slow. Classes did not start until the sun was in the sky. I picked the straightest line through the trees as I could, and started off, my boots slapping muddy puddles riddling the way. In the early morning the forest was empty of human presence apart from its familiar visitor in me, but it was creepy now, like someone was watching. A short while later it was clear I'd done something wrong. The trees were getting denser, and more closely packed together, like I was going further into the forest. I stopped and spun around. My first instinct was to go back. I was walking in a straight line, and I could go back to the slope base and start again. I had been walking in a straight line, hadn't I? Those nasty curls of fear tickled my insides again. I started to walk back, but stopped after less than half a mile. I scanned the ground. Horrified at what I did not see, I knelt down to get a better look. To my dismay, I could not see any footprints or other evidence I had passed this way. All clerics were master trackers, bested only by shifters who changed into predators like big cats. As a disciple I had been trained in the basics of tracking, of course, and at that moment I felt the bitter sting of failure. What I should have done the moment I felt lost is literally retraced my steps and started again. But I hadn't done that. I'd let the fear get one up on me, and plunged into the forest without thinking. I needed to calm down and focus. I figured if I went high, I could see further around me. I strode back a pace, and took a running jump at a broad oak trunk. I reached the lowest branch starting 5 feet or so above my head, and dug my fingertips into the bark. Tree climbing was easy, and in no time I hauled my body over the highest bough that would hold my weight. I balanced on my toes, hands to knees. Exhaling my breath was visible plumes of wispy vapor, and for a few seconds I chugged circular globules to amuse myself. It was cold, it being the end of autumn, but the cooler days didn't bother me. It was a welcome change since my body had always run hot. The clouds on the horizon were dark with rain, darker than the sky now. They rolled low and blocked out the coming light. There was a thick hum in the air, a sure sign a storm was blowing in. My heart did a jig in my chest, and my mood picked up, for I simply loved a good storm. The clean scent of crushed needle leaf on the breeze was refreshing, and a nice change to the ashy smell that saturated everything at the temple. Getting back on track, I looked around in a wide circle. I bit my lip and looked the circle again, slower this time. I was in trouble. I couldn't see the wall or the end of the forest. I must have run much further than I usually did before I'd fallen. Then I'd walked even further in the wrong direction. I stood, clasped the branch overhead and skipped to the edge of my perch. Loosening my hold above, I pushed back with my foot and both my arms stretched back. I arced into a crescent and was momentarily suspended in the air. The crown of my head raced to catch my arms as my legs coiled and flew overhead. The world was crazy for a second, up was down was up. Pointed feet followed my legs around and then I was falling. Feet a foot apart, my knees bent to absorb impact as I landed, arms extended either side of me for balance.